welcome everyone to this meeting tonight, organised by the Socialist Workers' Party, the live broadcast this evening. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Naima Omar. I'm a part of Tower Hamlets SWP branch, and I'm going to be facilitating and chairing this meeting today. So thank you everyone for joining. I can see there's people from all across the world who've joined this evening. This meeting is on race, class, and coronavirus, and I think it's incredibly important at this point to have this meeting, considering the disproportionary deaths of BME individuals across the world, here in the UK, and of course in the States. I think we have an amazing lineup of speakers who I'm going to introduce. But before I do, please do leave comments below and leave questions. We want you guys to be a part of the discussion. And of course, do share as widely as possible on all platforms. So now I'm going to introduce the speakers. So we're very lucky to have Michael Brown, who's an independent socialist activist organizer based in Long Beach, California. He's been involved in organizing against police terror, is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter chapter, campaigns on the issues regarding migrants' rights and worker strike struggle. And we've got Megan Parsons, who is an NHS junior doctor, an activist with Stand Up to Racism and Patients Not Passports. We also have Yuri Prasad, who's an author and a contributor to 2 books, which I surprisingly have beside me, which you could get from bookmarks. The first is A Rebel's Guide to Martin Luther King, which is this one. It's a quick, easy book to read, and it's amazing. And he's also a contributor to this book, which is Say It Loud, Marxism and the Fight Against Racism, which you can also get from bookmarks. So just to reiterate about how this is going to run, we're going to have our speakers speak, and then we're going to have time for questions, and then we'll come back to those questions, and we will have another round of questions, and they will also come back to those questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Megan Parsons, an NHS junior doctor and activist with Stand Up to Racism and Patients Not Passport, who will be leading us off with a 10-minute speech. So Megan, would you like to go ahead?
Okay. So thanks for having me, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to listening to Michael and Yuri. And I guess I wanted to start by thanking you guys for everything that you're doing, and for kind of coming to this meeting and having this discussion at this time, because I feel like these kind of things are really motivating. And then I wanted to thank all the key workers that are kind of working every day and putting their lives at risk for the services that we can't manage without. And I'd like to thank the key workers that are maybe getting a bit more recognition at the moment, but also the key workers who are still not getting the recognition that they deserve. The key workers behind the scenes, key workers in each family, and the key workers in the arts and all other places. And I guess with this pandemic, what it's shown us is just kind of so obviously who the key workers in this country are, and who it is that we can't manage without, and who we rely on in a crisis. And I think when these people have been shown so clearly, we have to recognise them, but we also have to act on this recognition. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I wanted to recognise all the key workers who have lost their lives during this pandemic, and to thank them for everything that they've done and for their contributions, but also to acknowledge the cases of avoidable deaths, and to support the calls for greater protection for all key workers, so that they can feel safe when providing the services that we can't manage without. And key workers shouldn't have to risk their lives or lose their lives to be recognised and valued, and that this country has 3 million key workers earning below the living wage is appalling. And whilst you can't quantify someone's value in financial terms, and you can't show recognition purely in financial means, that at this time when we're holding these people up as heroes in the fight against coronavirus. And we're also undermining their ability to cope economically as individuals. And I just think that that's an affront. So I was getting a taxi the other day because I don't drive, and the driver, who's another key worker, spoke of how he had to work because financially he couldn't afford to stay at home. And he spoke of picking up other customers in the same boat as him who were trying to hide their coughs and their symptoms. And he spoke of the anxiety and the guilt that he felt upon returning home to his partner and his 3 young children. And I think the fact that there are great swathes of this country who can't afford to abide by the coronavirus physical distancing guidance is just appalling, and it completely undermines this country's ability to deal with this pandemic and causes so much avoidable morbidity and mortality. And as with many diseases, the death toll in the most deprived parts of England and Wales is double that of the most affluent areas. And then again, as with most diseases, the death toll inequality here is avoidable as the money's there. And we've seen in this pandemic, we've seen the magic money trees, but we also see that we're still pretty selective with who's able to reap the produce from them. And so we're kind of preferencing people who are already managing pretty well, as they're seen to be kind of better at managing money and to have worked for what they have. But we don't see the family of 4 who are managing on a single minimum wage as good at managing money, or the person who's juggling 2 jobs and childcare, or the people who just kind of getting through the day is a struggle as having worked for everything that they have. And I guess this idea that your wealth shows how deserving you are, and that we should preference helping those who kind of are by a kind of narrow standard of measures termed deserving, is just so prevalent in our society that we see it in all areas of the pandemic. So like I mentioned before, that I've really enjoyed seeing people kind of come together during this pandemic. And I really enjoyed the kind of acts of kindness that small businesses and groups and individuals have shown towards key workers. But when I look at the role that big businesses have shown, when I see that I, as a doctor who's paid kind of quite above the median salary, is being offered free meals, free drinks, free electronics. I guess firstly, I see that when companies can offer these things for free on such a large scale, surely they can afford to pay their workers a bit better, or surely they can afford to pay the taxes that they owe this country. But also when I see that I'm offered all of these things for free, it's just reminds me of the contrast with those people who are struggling so much more than I am to put food on the table, and with my patients who are struggling to find 3 meals a day, or with the parents who are going hungry so that their children can eat. And beside the fact that none of these things should be happening in one of the richest countries in the world, if the aim of these companies is to raise morale, I know that kind of looking after those in society who are in a bit greater need and finding things harder at this time would rekindle my faith in society, and would be the greatest morale boost that I could have. And it would also make my job a lot easier and my patients a lot safer if, rather than me being offered unlimited internet, my patients were offered unlimited internet, so that we could complete our reviews via video link. And then I guess this idea that we should only help those who are deserving plays out kind of between classes, but then we also see it plays out between ethnicities when we look at a lot of the rhetoric around immigration in the UK. And so I'm all for the arguments that have come out of coronavirus, kind of the arguments that look at the contributions of immigrants and the descendants of immigrants towards the NHS and our other key services. And when I last spoke about coronavirus, I spoke about the additional fears faced by many key workers whose families depend on their income or their visas, because for these people, on top of dealing with the increased anxiety of risking their lives every day, they're also fearing, in the event of the loss of their lives, for the families and for their families and their children who kind of, due to this country's hostile immigration policies, would feel that their position in this society was unsecure. So since then, I guess I really welcome the decision to give families of key workers who died during this pandemic indefinite leave to remain. But kind of, as one of my colleagues said, I would also say, why wait until their relative is dead? Because it seems to me kind of a pretty big ask to lose your life to prove your value to this country. And I guess the meritocracy that's running through our immigration system, it results in people not being seen as being worthy or having to prove that they're of value to this society. And that value is often pinned on their wealth or their talent in skills that are attached to financial gain or skills that this country needs. And so talks of immigration's contribution to the NHS and to society often move from recognising the kind of the role that immigrants have played in order to counter misinformation or to counter negative stereotypes towards claims making around specific immigrant populations being exempt from legislation that will continue to govern other immigrants. And again, this is differentiating the population into those who are worthy through being of use to us and those who are not. And I'd say that immigration, it's not just about a person's economic worth to this country, but it's also about this country's duty to the global population, particularly if we look at kind of the historical and ongoing impacts that we've had. And I guess one thing that we have been hearing throughout this pandemic is that the virus doesn't differentiate and nobody is exempt from it. But what we're seeing now is that it does differentiate, or at least kind of that the risk factors do differentiate, and also the risk factors for becoming unwell do differentiate. And so we're seeing it differentiating by class and also by race. And I think there's been a lot of suggestions about why this might be. There's genetics, lifestyle, exposure, the BME population's view of health services and the health services view of BME patients. And whilst I'd say like we still kind of may not be able to quantify the exact impact of each of these suggestions, the one thing that I would see all of them having in common is power and an imbalance in power resulting in morbidity and mortality. So I guess kind of many of us will know Michael Marmot, and he's written about what he calls how unnecessary deaths and suffering of disadvantaged people, whether in poor countries or rich, is a result of the way we organise our affairs in society. And then he argues that failing to meet the fundamental human needs of autonomy, empowerment, and human freedom is a potent cause of ill health. So whilst I think that we should focus on addressing coronavirus in every level, in order to address the kind of disparities in this pandemic and also the causes of all causes of ill health, we must address the dangerous inequalities that remain in workplaces, in communities, in this country, and on a global scale in power. And then I guess in addition to kind of holding the potential for addressing health inequalities, giving power to those who traditionally don't have power or don't have voice, it may also provide us with alternatives to how we organise our society and alternatives to our approaches to health and well-being. So I guess kind of with power imbalances in mind, I feel that we also must predict how these might play out through the course of this pandemic. And was looking at what Lincoln Phelan argues. So they say that the capacity to control disease and death creates disparities. And when we make gains in our ability to control disease, people with more knowledge, more money, power, prestige, and beneficial social connections are better able to harness the benefits of the control we have developed. So I guess whilst I'm eager for us to develop a vaccine, I can't help but think of all the kind of long line of medical advancements that we've made that have failed to make the journey towards those who are in the greatest need in the majority world. And so I feel that we also have to be addressing those power imbalances at this time as well. And then I guess kind of looking at power, I feel that we also should reflect on the inequalities and the global priorities that provided the environment in which this strain of coronavirus was created, and then also allowed it to spread, whilst despite governments being advised to lock down. And then I guess we also have to reflect on how kind of scapegoating migrants, UK minority groups, and those to be seen as kind of making poor lifestyle choices for failings in our NHS distracted us from the true causes of the failings and left us with a healthcare service that's far less able to deal with this pandemic than it could have been. And then I guess to finish, like, whilst I'd say the pandemic is a travesty, and it's heartbreaking to see all this unnecessary anguish and loss of life. The only way I see forward is for us to learn from it and to transform things for the better. And I guess at every level, we've seen the positive impacts that individuals and groups have made during this crisis. And we've seen the desire among so many of our friends, our colleagues, our families, and our communities to ensure that we never go back to normal, because normal wasn't working for so many people. And I guess valuing people based solely on their economic contributions can't be normal. And then having members of the public donating to the NHS if it's a charity, whilst the government strip it to its bare bones, shouldn't be normal. And then having our population, our key workers, or anybody relying on food banks and working below the living wage in a country where the six richest people have the same wealth as the poorest 13 million should never be normal again. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the questions and to hearing the rest of you guys.
Oh, thank you, Megan. So thank you so much, Megan, for leading that off. Currently, we have over 450 people watching us at the moment, so that's incredible. But please do share, and also do leave your comments below with questions that we will get a chance to read out. We do have 2 rounds of questions, so the more questions, the better. Next up, our next speaker, which I'm so excited to introduce, is Michael Brown, joining us from the States in the early hours of the morning. And thank you for joining us. So Michael is an independent socialist, an activist organizer based in Long Beach, California. He's been a part of organizing against police terror. It's a co-founder of Black Lives Matter chapter. Is campaigning on the issues regarding immigration rights and workers' strikes support as well. And Michael will be speaking for 10 minutes or so. So please do lead off, Michael.
For sure. Thanks so much, Naeem. I really appreciate that introduction. And it's definitely a pleasure following Megan and also being on the panel with Yuri. So I just want to give a big salute to all the comrades, especially over in the UK, and also the Socialist Workers Party for opening up this opportunity for me to talk about what's going on here in the States and, just give you my perspective on things. And definitely big shout out to everybody who's tuned in right now. There's a million other things y'all could be doing, but I'm really appreciative that y'all, decided to tune in for us. So with me, I got some bullet points written down here. I'm gonna be hitting on some of the same things that Megan talked about, and also what Yuri wrote about in one of his recent articles about this pandemic definitely not being genetic or biological, but having some real material and some real tangible roots as to why it exists. So I won't promise to be exhaustive or get to everything, but we'll just hit upon some major things. So the first thing I want to kind of lay out for folks who are not in the States is kind of overview or just the picture of what's happening. And I'm gonna mostly talk about Black folks. We always talk about people of color, and those are definitely our allies as well and coalition builders. But when it comes to the racial paradigm in America, it starts on the Black and white kind of lens, and then everything is framed from there. So just first off, I just want to share like an old saying, that older Black folks have always passed down to us here in America. And it goes like this. It says, when America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. That's something I always heard growing up. And it's really apropos right now. And what that's really speaking to, it's an old saying, but what it's talking about is it just speaks to the disparate outcomes and how problems and issues in this society, which one may assume, may have the same impact on all people, it actually doesn't. So what it's basically saying is when white America gets a cold, black America gets pneumonia. And the COVID-19 crisis is no difference. There's some people running around here talking about it's the quote unquote great equalizer, but now, this latest pneumonia, so to speak, is proven to, really be ravaging the lives of working class Black people in this country. So I won't get too stat heavy because we're really pressed for time here, and we want to really open it up for questions. But just for some key numbers and some context to paint a picture, as Comrade Yuri pointed out in his recent article, like I said earlier, none of this is biological, none of this is genetic. I mean, there's a direct correlation between who's being infected by COVID-19, how and why they're being infected, and ultimately whether they live or die. There's a direct correlation between that and also their class position in society. None of these outcomes exist due to happenstance or any kind of mysteries, and I say that because, recently, I think about a week ago, at a presser, Donald Trump, the president, he was asked about, the disproportionate effect that this thing is having on Black folks here in America. And he used the word, I think it was quote unquote surprise. There's no surprises about this, because when it comes to cataclysms or anything in this country, whether it be Hurricane Katrina or COVID-19 or floods, poor people get hit the worst. And, disproportionately Black people in this country are poor. So I just want to get into some of the reasons as to why this is happening in America, and according to some of the latest statistics I had tracked down, Black Americans, we comprise 20% of all service workers. That's places like Walmart, fast food restaurants. We're 30% of all bus drivers. We're 21% of everybody who works at the post office. And, according to the last census, we're only like 12 to 13% of the population. And then, those numbers are even more stark when you start looking at our numbers at corporate behemoths like Amazon and Walmart, where we make up a real disproportionate amount of the workforce. So in addition to these essential employment opportunities, that we're always, kind of stuck into when it comes to the American economy, mass incarceration is proven to be another, site of, large infection when it comes to Black folks in America. As people know, America incarcerates like a quarter of the people who are incarcerated on this earth. That's 2 million people who are locked up in this country, and half of them are Black. So you could just think of, CDC guidelines trying to be followed in these barracks, in these basically dungeons, that are the prisons in this country. I think the last time I checked, as of like right now, service workers are really being affected by COVID-19. Older folks at like retirement facilities and total care facilities are really being infected, and also prisoners who are disproportionately Black. So a lot of people have been, use this opportunity to try to get a lot of low-level offenders and also non-violent offenders, released in places like New York and LA especially, which are these big hubs of Black mass incarceration. Other than that, another effect that this is really having on Black folks, is, when you start looking at the homeless population, which is a disenfranchised population in this country that doesn't have access to, basic necessities like hand washing, like hand sanitizer, things of that nature, shelter. So when they sheltered in place, that was one of the first questions a lot of us were asking, especially here in LA, because we're like the epicenter of homelessness in this country. A lot of people come here for the weather, and they tend to stay here, even if they don't have a place to live. So that was the main question a lot of us were asking is, how can you shelter in place if you're homeless, So, and then even when you look at things like sheltering in place and when they start imposing, stay at home orders, that poses, other questions for us as well, because if you know anything about stop and frisk and the racist nature of the police in this country, we're not in a position to look at these as just these innocuous kind of issues, that are going to hit everybody the same. That was one of my first questions when they start sheltering in place and issuing orders and, you see the National Guard being called up, I immediately start thinking of issues like, Watts, or like just a few days ago, we had I think it was the 28th anniversary of the LA riots, or Ferguson. When I think of the National Guard being amongst a civilian population, if you're a Black person in America, you got to start thinking about that kind of stuff. Like, okay, what does this mean for us? Because we know that, when it comes to policing, um, according to all the stats and all of our lived experiences, we don't get police the same as everybody else in this country. So, that poses a lot of different questions there. So that's just some of the issues that have been happening um, to Black folks in general in this country, some of the questions being posed. So another thing I want to get into is just, what's kind of been the response so far. The response from both sides, both the Republicans and the Democrats, is, as you can guess, has been woefully inadequate. I mean, we had what's this guy's name? Jerome Adams. He was the U.S. Surgeon General. Like in a press conference a few weeks ago, he was talking about, Black folks and people of color needing to, drink less and smoke less, which totally just, absolves the whole system of its, systematic uh, locking us into poverty and puts it all on the individual. And then when you look at the other side of the aisle, things aren't all that much better. Van Jones, who's a well-known liberal commentator, kind of one of the stalwarts of corporate media, CNN, MSNBC, and that whole crowd, he mentioned lifestyle choices, which is basically, the same thing that the right wingers are talking about. So they always try to, take these systematic problems and structural issues and, and reduce it back to the individual, which is, right in line with the whole neoliberal uh, nexus or paradigm, however you want to say it. So yeah, you start seeing that from both sides of the aisles. They're not talking about structural and systemic issues, but they're bringing it back to the individual and quote unquote personal responsibility. So, and then another thing we've seen from both sides is, in terms of the Republicans, I mean, they basically spearheaded this stimulus package that happened recently, which was really just a corporate giveaway. And despite you having some pretty audible, speech makers on the other side, people like Ocasio-Cortez and even Bernie Sanders, they got up there and they was, doing a fire and brimstone act in Congress, but, they all co-signed the shit. They all passed it, so there was no opposition up there or any advocates for working class people in this country when it came to giving all these trillions of dollars to these banks and these private corporations who didn't even need to be bailed out. So yeah, that's just been a little bit of the response. And just real quick, because we're coming up on the wrap up, I just want to talk a little bit about what's been the pushback. And so far, as you can imagine, it's been pretty splintered. I wish I could say that Black folks were in a great position in this country as far as having left-wing organization and also having a robust union movement, but we don't. It's something that has to be rebuilt from the ground up. But I am heartened by the fact that the fast food workers and also the service workers, they haven't laid down and taken this. They've been fighting back. They've been mobilizing. We've seen like 150 wildcat strikes ever since the beginning of March, and many of those have been led by Black workers at places like the auto factories, at Amazon, at Instacart, at here in LA recently we had Pizza Hut workers and McDonald's workers who were spearheading strike actions where they just walked out, no union sanction, no permission, none of that. They just took it upon themselves to really initiate that action. Also, you've had groups like Cooperation Jackson, which is based in Jackson, Mississippi, and also the Black Socialists of America, which is a small group, but they've been punching far above their weight. They've been initiating what they're calling a general strike. It's not really a general strike, but what they're calling for is the first of every month. They want people to take action such as rent strikes, labor strikes, and things of that nature. And in addition to that, you've had a lot of groups around the country who are very small, kind of scattered, initiating, mutual aid projects and just helping out each other. So that's been some of the pushback that we've been seeing. We got a long road ahead of us, but I think this presents a really good opportunity to really build a Black left, especially coming off of the Bernie Sanders failed campaign, where a lot of young Black folks deviated from the Democratic Party establishment and Democratic Party in general, and they voted for Bernie. And, many of them right now are pledging that they won't even vote for either of these candidates in November. They're not going to fall for the lesser evilism. So we're starting to see that, in this post-Obama era, this era where where you had Ferguson and Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street, which gave a lot of fervent to these different movements and to this different kind of political mentality that has been taking place. So yeah, those are just some things I want to touch on real quick. I'll end it here because I'm going over a little bit, but I'm definitely looking forward to coming back to the questions and also chiming in a little bit later with some more opinions.
Oh, okay, thank you so much, Michael, for that. And it's incredible to hear about struggles across the world and especially in the States. And I think the fight continues and we have to constantly be pushing back. Just before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to say we have 500 people currently watching. Please do share, and please, of course, leave questions and comments and below. We will have a chance to read out your questions. So we do want you to be a part of this discussion because it's incredibly important. Our next speaker is Yuri Prasad, who I said is an author of A Rebel's Guide to Martin Luther King and is a contributor to Say Out Loud, Marxism and the Fight Against Racism. You can purchase both of this on Bookmarks online and they are currently doing delivery. So without further ado, Yuri.
Thanks, Naima, and thanks to Megan and Michael for really excellent introductions. Really enjoyed listening to Michael and telling us something about what's happening in the States, particularly interests us over here. I want to start by saying, how many times in recent years has someone said to you, why do you always make things about race? It's such a common refrain, and it comes mostly as a whinge from right-wingers who fear equality and are opposed to equality, and you occasionally hear it from some who describe themselves as on the left, who think that identity politics somehow has replaced class politics. So there's this kind of, we're racializing questions is something that's often told to us. Well, the practical outcome of not talking about race or downplaying race, or arguing that somehow or another we live in a post-racial society because we've had a black US president and we've got two Asian chancellors in succession and one Asian Home Secretary here in Britain, the practical outcome of not talking about race should now be clear. The fact that we don't accurately know how many BME people in Britain have died from the virus is because those in authority did not see any reason to keep count. It's a result of not talking about race and thinking that race is not a factor. After the event, the government now says we need to understand why BME people have been disproportionately affected, but beneath their crocodile tears comes a blame game. So, we also hear, how many times do we hear when someone has died that that person had underlying health conditions? And I just feel like that is the devaluation of their life. That we're told that the implication really of saying that is that somehow or another they brought this upon themselves. And when they say that, particularly about BME deaths, I think what they're saying is that our culture plays a role, or our genetics plays a role, or there are other factors which are specific to us and to do solely with us that are to blame here. And these explanations are very convenient because they locate the problem at the level of the individual. It's our fault our diets are wrong. It's our fault that we don't exercise enough. It's our fault that we live in multi-generational housing. It's our fault that we don't see the doctor often enough and that we don't stick to our meds. All of these things become individualized and we don't see them in any kind of context. And not only does this suggest that there's something inherent and therefore racially coded into us, but crucially it ignores the systematic way that inequality in society finds its expression in our health. Capitalist society determines who gets sick, how sick they get, and whether they live or die. It does so today just as surely as it did when children were sent into mines and mills in the 18th century. There's no difference really in terms of how people's health outcomes. Capitalism is the biggest determinant of of how your health is going to be. We know that workers doing the lowest esteemed jobs, people driving Ubers, people helping the sick, people driving buses, people providing care to the elderly, are amongst the hardest hit. And we also know that these jobs are disproportionately occupied by BME people. So it's quite easy to see who's suffering, but the question for us as socialists has to be, who benefits from this system of discrimination? Who gains when 1/3 of Bengali families live in overcrowded conditions compared to around 2% of the white population? Or who benefits when 18% of the English NHS workforce is BME, but senior health management comprise of 93% white? So, you know, these huge disparities are obvious, but the question for us must be, who benefits from that? Now, I want to try and answer that. It's common sense to believe that white people as a whole gain from this setup, and that by implication, all BME people lose. And I want to argue that that's too simplistic. Whilst it's absolutely the case that BME people are at the sharp end of this crisis, it's not true that all BME people are facing the same risks and the same outcomes. For a start, on the question of testing, if you're wealthy, you can buy a test no matter what your skin color. If someone in your family tests positive, it's easier to self-isolate in a big house with several bathrooms and a well-stocked kitchen than if you're poor. And if you get sick, there's no 5-hour wait for NHS 111 to call you back, because if you're rich, you can go private. And all of those things apply to rich people, whatever their pigmentation. So not all BME people are at the sharp end. And it's also true to say that most white people are not privileged in this situation. If we look at, say, nursing assistants, for example, in the NHS, 83% of NHS nursing assistants are white. Can we say that they are the people who are benefiting from the discrimination that exists? Most of them are earning less than £18,000 a year and can barely get hold of PPE, even if they're working on a COVID ward. They can join the online queue for a test, only to find that all the tests are gone within the 30 minutes. In what sense are they beneficiaries from this situation? Of course, there are real differences in the way people, and especially poor people, are treated because of their perceived race and ethnicity. I'm not trying to say that people are all working class people are all treated equally. We're not. It really is differentiated, and race is a big factor in that. And Marxists should be amongst the first to point this out. We should be the people who are pointing out the discrimination that's going on and making people aware of the disparities that exist under the system. But we also have another important duty, and that's to show that the real beneficiary of discrimination is the capitalist system. So long as workers of different hues look at each other as competitors and enemies, we will be forever squabbling amongst ourselves for crumbs from the master's table. In order to unite, we have to smash down the terrible chauvinism that does exist amongst some workers. Those who think that their fair complexion and Britishness give them something in common with the elite must be shown the truth, and those who can't be one must be isolated to stop their poison from infecting others. Our rulers are involved in a desperate attempt to convince us that we're all in it together for the so-called national interest. The reality is that class and racial divisions make a mockery of these notions. You know, it's the argument, the nonsense that comes from Boris Johnson about us all having a common interest, when the way this disease is affecting people on a race and class basis is now so obvious for people to see, it tells us something about what the purpose of those statements are. And they're to try and create a false community and a false collective identity amongst people here, to think that will overcome and that will obscure the class and racial divides that exist. Now, I think our overarching task is to try and convince workers of all backgrounds that if we combine together our superior numbers and the essential role we play in society and the economy and our collective intellect, means that we can settle for much more than crumbs. You know, I think what we've shown during the course of this crisis is is that we do the serious work in this society. The people who tell us that they're the captains of industry, they're the brains behind the operation, they're the people at the top of the society are there because they're the cleverest, they're the most astute. Where are they now? Where are they now? Where is Richard Branson now? Where are the multimillionaire class now? Living on islands as far away from here as possible. Whilst we, our class, are the people who are getting their hands dirty, either driving us to work, making meals for us, looking after our parents, looking after us when we're sick, all of those people. We're the people who've been told that our job is just to sit and take it. Now our task as socialists is to turn that on its head, to give people a sense of their own power and their own potential, and say, in order to do that, we have to smash the racial divide. We have to smash the prejudice that does exist in order to make a basis for a united response. So that's where I'd like to leave it.
Thank you so much, Yuri. Thank you to all of our speakers for the question and all of our speakers for leading off. We do have a number of questions. Just before I read the questions out, we want more to come in because we're going to have another round. So please do leave questions below and also do continue to share. So the first question is, what role has institutionalized racism played in the COVID crisis? That comes from Simon. And the next one is from Mike, who says, how do we organize to prevent danger and illness to workers in the US and here, especially low paid, many of whom are Black and are people of color? And we have another question from Josh, which I believe is probably directed to Michael, and everyone else can answer, of course, about there's a lot of people who seem to have mobilized behind Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. What are the aspects for socialists to organize in this moment? And luckily, we have a bonus question. I guess we normally do 3, 4, but we have another question. And the question is, what do the panelists think the unions can make demands and fight for better pay and conditions during this crisis? So yeah, we're going to mix this up, and we're going to start with Michael first, who will have 5 to 7 minutes to come back on these questions. So would you like to go ahead, Michael?
Definitely. Thanks for throwing it my way, Naima. So I'll be pretty quick with these. So as far as the first question, preventing danger and illness for workers in the USA or the UK. I think we're seeing living, breathing examples on how to combat these issues, that are sitting right in front of us. I mentioned earlier all the numerous strike activity that we've seen here in the US, and I know overseas and particularly in Europe. I mean, there's been lots of actions, which is you guys' tradition, even more so than ours. We're several, due to McCarthyism and red baiting and the class collaborationist nature of our unions here. We're several decades removed from, seeing the type of militancy in our working class that we've been seeing over this past month. I mean, we've had some episodes here over the past few years, with teacher strikes and some of the actions we've seen with the UAW. Although those actions haven't gone far enough. Even the fight for 15 for fast food workers, as uneven as it is, it's done a lot to raise, class consciousness amongst workers. But yeah, I think some of the best remedies to combat, some of the issues we're facing in the workplace is people banding together. I know that sounds cliche, but we're growing up in societies where they told us things like, people quote unquote flipping burgers, didn't have that much value, but now those people are classified as quote unquote essential workers. There's this whole campaign going on right now, but with all the big corporations in America where they're lauding and celebrating working people as quote unquote heroes. And what that really is it's a con game, because they're calling you a hero in lieu of giving you the proper amount of PPE or the proper amount of hazard pay, or paid time off and things like that, or telling you things as simple as, hey, I'm working in the Amazon warehouse with 2 or 3 people who are infected. So instead of doing all that, what they want to do is they want to call you a hero, which is just, a con game, like I said. So yeah, I think people banding together, realizing their own power, the points of production. We make these societies move. They don't move without us, particularly in, healthcare and logistics, which is really big in this country. And we've seen a lot of activity, amongst truck drivers and in warehouses all across this country. And, these people, they've been winning. It's not about writing to your congressman. It's not about electing the right Democrat. It's been about, straight up action at the points of production. And people have been able to wrench some concessions almost immediately at a lot of these places. In some cases, the same day. I mean, if you and your 10 coworkers decide to walk out of the Pizza Hut, which did happen here in LA, I mean, those folks got concessions within 2 hours. It was crazy, so that's where the real power lies. And then a second question, I didn't write it down, but it's about Bernie Sanders, I believe. As far as what opportunity that presents for socialists to organize. I mean, I'm to the left of Bernie Sanders, so, I didn't really buy into the whole Bernie thing all that much myself. But I think he was a good vehicle to raise some class consciousness. And I think what we're seeing out of his campaign amongst the people who drew the right lessons is, they're continuing the on the ground work that they were doing prior to his election. A lot of his people came out of Occupy, they came out of Black Lives Matter, they came out of real grassroots movements. So I think a lot of the people are returning back to those works, whether it be mutual aid networks or some of the rent strike activity that we're seeing around the country, or even in some of the labor union and unorganized workers' actions that we've seen around the country. People are returning to that work. They're not getting too caught up into electoral politics. So I think that's a great opportunity for socialists to plug into work and continue it despite their candidate not being able to win. And it definitely has changed the conversation in this country as well. Wealth inequality is on the tip of everybody's lips right now, especially, the backdrop where you got the backdrop of a pandemic where they're handing out hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars, to already wealthy people. And they're giving us a measly $1,200 check, which is just some BS. So, you can't have all of these different contending forces and contradictions and not, at least start asking some larger questions about the society. So, unfortunately, I forgot the last question, but maybe we can pass it around and I can look at it in a minute.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So next up we have Yuri going to be answering the questions. Would you like to go ahead, Yuri?
Yeah, I was really interested in what Michael was saying there about Bernie, because obviously we see it through a slightly refracted lens over here. So to hear an activist in the States telling us how it is very interesting. And I suppose for me, what's interesting about both Bernie and to an extent Corbyn over here in Britain is the way it opened people's minds to the possibilities of envisaging a life beyond capitalism, to thinking about a different way of organizing society. And I think now there must be many thousands of people who, having gone through the experiences of Bernie and of Corbyn, and now being faced with the pandemic, are thinking that we have to live in a very different kind of society. It's not a question of a luxury of choice. Well, this is something that's an absolute necessity if we're going to take on the key questions of the environment, which actually gave rise to the pandemic, and the question of food, and so many of the vital questions of now. And so what interests me about that is the relationship between that question and the question of how do we organize, because it's positive to think about how we want the world to look in the future. I'm in favor of people doing that. But let's think concretely about this, that the fight for the future has to begin now. And I know that we work in a very restricted time that makes collective action much more difficult than it normally is. But to think that we can just sit on our hands until this lockdown is over and then suddenly launch the fight is wrong. We have to think about the people who are suffering now and how do we create political pressure now. And that means, I think, taking some risks and doing some things which provoke the people's ire and make people think a bit more about these questions. So I want to congratulate all the health workers who have been trying to turn the silent protests that there were this week to Workers' Memorial Day into something more political by demanding proper PPE and proper testing and better equipment, but also those workers who say, how am I supposed to live on £19,000 a year and you're calling me a hero, but I can't feed my family? Now we have to find a way of making their demands central as well. And whether that means making banners and posters and sticking them up outside hospitals and other places where they're going to see an audience, whether that means doing a lot of online stuff, which I know people are doing, whether it means trying to politicize the weekly claps for the NHS. I think we've all got to think about, what opportunity do I have to raise the political stakes in this game, to make the idea of we're not going back to the old normal at the end of this something more than just a nice dream, a nice thought. So I think, we have to get our hands dirty with that kind of thing. I just wanted to end on the question of institutional racism, because the question of institutional racism in the NHS is not a new question. If you went back a year or so, you would have seen a major report into bullying, racist bullying inside the NHS, in which a majority of BME staff in the NHS said that they had been racially targeted, usually by their managers. And so, the people have been trying to raise these points for several years now, and only now are we beginning to see that people want to, in management, are starting to pay attention. But why are they paying attention? They're paying attention because we're making a noise. What that should tell us is we have to make more noise. We have to think about why not only the people who are disproportionately affected by the disease and the mortality rates and so on, but we also have to think about, why is it the case that so many people at the bottom of the NHS, the people doing the lowest rung jobs, are Black and Asian? Why is that the case? And why is it the case that so many staff, even further up the chain, complain about the racism of the structures and their superiors? And I think we should make that very much part of our campaigning in the future.
Thank you so much, Yuri, for answering those questions. And before I bring in Megan, I just really want to reiterate, please do continue to share, and please do continue to ask questions. We have another round coming up. So, Megan, would you like to take on those questions?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, it's been really interesting hearing the other answers as well. And I guess, I just wanted to address the first one about the role of institutional racism's had on the COVID crisis. And I guess going back to some of the reasons that people have put out there for there being kind of a disparity in the deaths by race. Not necessarily reasons that I would agree with, but just some of the ones that are out there, and kind of starting with the first one, which is lifestyle, and picking up on what Michael was saying about kind of people being told if they just make healthy choices and good lifestyle choices, then their health would improve. And I mean, kind of ignoring the obvious fact that often people have very, very little choice, and kind of going back to what Marmot says about the kind of choice that people have in their lives being related to their health, and that kind of if people don't have the options to make the choices that they would want to make, or if people are facing other difficulties that narrow their choices. If I think of things that are typically seen as a poor lifestyle choice, when I ask my patients kind of whether they would want to do that or whether they would want to change it, and they generally say they would want to change it, this is also kind of whether people should have to change and have to make healthy lifestyle choices for their lives to be of value is also kind of a thing that's completely up for debate. But the fact that there are patients who would want to change the lifestyles that they lead, but they aren't able to, whether it's because of kind of undue stress or whether it's because services aren't available to them that are available to other people, there's plenty of things that I would say kind of in terms of institutional racism, just the ability for people to lead the lives that they want to lead, to have kind of good housing and all of these things that we know kind of result in improved health. But then also kind of moving on to exposure. So I was reading a thing from it was Black nurses in Birmingham saying that they felt that they were being moved from kind of safer areas of healthcare onto the front line. And so I think kind of potentially there's the increase in exposure, either because people are already working in these frontline jobs, kind of as the statistics that Michael and Yuri have given us show, but also they were being moved to those jobs as well. And then I think potentially that's where maybe the power imbalances come in, and that because I know among BAME doctors, they know that they're more likely to receive complaints, more likely to be brought up against the GMC. And I've heard people say that they're not going to bother to kind of argue something, or they're not going to, they can't really say no because they don't feel that they're in that situation, or they don't have that power. And particularly my colleagues that have perhaps come from overseas and already feel that there's a hostile environment towards them, and then they don't want to be seen to be difficult or to be rocking the boat. And then looking at BAME perceptions of health services, and I think this is a really key one because as people have said, I think as Yuri said before, that people are often saying don't make everything about race, and I've heard that being said by my colleagues. And I think that when I saw kind of some of my Maori colleagues offended by a kind of morale boosting or a video that was meant to boost morale that was made by some healthcare professionals in this country, I kind of thought about how that must make them see our healthcare service and how unwelcoming our healthcare service might be to various members of the BAME population. So I'd say that kind of institutional racism occurs there, but then also with how the BAME population are seen by healthcare services. So I remember when I was in A&E, and a colleague of mine told me that a patient had Mrs. Beebe syndrome, which is a kind of stereotype that's often given if someone, generally an Asian woman, an older woman, is complaining of pain, and generally English may not be her first language, so we can't get a good history, and it'll be kind of dismissed as, oh, it's Mrs. Beebe syndrome, she's saying there's too much pain, there's nothing really wrong with her. And so I do kind of wonder about when BAME people present to healthcare services, how their concerns are explored and how their concerns are addressed. Particularly when I remember reading something about when we practice on dummies, we're practicing just CPR and emergencies. The dummies that are fairer in skin have better outcomes than the dummies that are darker complexion. And so, I mean, if it's happening at that absolute basic level, I'd be interested to see kind of how it's impacting at different levels. And also, I'd just reiterate, I think it was Yuri who was saying that we're not even counting the race of this population and of the people who are dying. And I know with maternal mortality, that only came about that we found out that Black women are 5 times more likely to die as a result of a complication during childbirth than white women, because we started counting the statistics and counting the race of the women dying. So if we're not even doing that, I don't know how we can kind of make decisions and how we can act on them. So yeah, I'd support that, and I'd also support a kind of an inquiry into all of this so that we can act on it now, and also so that we can learn for the future. I'm really bad with time, so I feel like I'm probably done for time. Is that good? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Megan, and thank you all of you for answering those questions, and thank you for everyone who has put questions and contributions. Then read out another round of questions now for our speakers, but just to reiterate, as I will constantly, please do share so as many people could watch this across the world. And I think I just wanted to add one thing. What Megan was talking about, all I remembered was the question of Serena Williams, her near-death experience, that really brought that question to the highlight about the treating of Black women during childbirth and so forth. So without further ado, I want to bring some questions. And before I do, there is a comment which is from Charlotte, that says, if a group of Black Americans had invaded the state legislation with guns and automatic weapons, they would have been shot dead. Right-wing white people did it in Michigan and Trump said they were good people. I think those images was absolutely shocking to see. And we have a question from Nadia, who says, we could see that the question of Black death is being discussed more in the media and public forums, and many of my friends see this as a sign that after the lockdown there'll be less racism. What would the speakers respond to this assumption? And more than that, what can we do to fight for anti-racist conclusion after the crisis? And we also have another question from Raj, who says, in the era of Trump's racism, what are the prospects prospects are there for overcoming racial divisions and forgoing unity between blacks and whites in the States? I guess that's another question for Michael. And our last question, which is from Joshua, who asks is, the Tories and Trump are looking for ways to force people back to work and school. Now they are trying to find scientists who are willing to scrap the 2-meter safety distance. Can speakers talk about the political use of science and expertise? And what do you think socialists will need to take on this? What do you think socialists will need to take on this debate more now? I hope those questions are clear. So I'm going to bring in Megan first, if that's okay. And then we're going to have Michael and Yuri. So Megan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I guess kind of on the last question about the political use of science, I think this is something that I'm really interested in kind of the scientific advances that we make and the impact of society at the time on those. So the way that society kind of directs what things we choose to look into and what things we choose to explore, but then it also impacts kind of every stage of that research process. So kind of how we decide that we're going to explore something, what we decide are our valuable measures, and then kind of how we interpret the data that we've got, and then also kind of what we decide we have to do to act on it. So yeah, I do think that socialists kind of will need to be taking up this debate, and I think that we have kind of for a long time as well, because I think every time we say that kind of another world is possible, we're saying that yes, kind of how things are at the moment might be seen as human nature, or I think like Michael was talking about neoliberalism, and I think often neoliberal creeds get taken as human nature, that people are competitive and people are greedy, and kind of a lot of research then gets done into why are people competitive and greedy. But if we kind of step back and look at, well, what's the context that research is being done in? It's in a society where you have a benefit to saying, well, people are naturally greedy and we need to work on empathy and we need to teach empathy, rather than to look at other societies where maybe people are naturally more communal and there is naturally more empathy. So I do think that looking at kind of how our political environment and our socioeconomic environment and the kind of priorities that we have as a society impact on the research that we do and the outcomes that we find from that research is key, especially at this time where we can see a lot of kind of tensions in a society that is often prioritizing the kind of economic health of the country, and we talk about it as health as though it's on a par with kind of the health of the population, and as though the economy isn't just there to provide the health of the population, and it's kind of seen as our main focus rather than our population being our main focus. So I definitely, I really like that question. I definitely think that kind of looking at the political use of science and knowledge is really key at the moment. But then also, I just wanted to come to the question about whether there'll be less racism after the virus. And I think there is definitely opportunity there, because I think just the number of people that I've seen that have been so outraged with how things have been managed, how the government is, the number of people that I've seen calling for kind of BAME groups to be able to work in the NHS as they're qualified. It's just our kind of immigration policies that are stopping them, and all of these kinds of things. But I also see quite a few people starting to say, well, things can't carry on as they are now, and it's cost a lot of money, kind of, well, they've said bailing people out during this coronavirus, and so afterwards there's going to have to be more austerity, and we don't have these endless kind of supplies of money. So I do think that it will be a fight after coronavirus, but what I hope is the kind of anger that people have got during it, and the kind of motivation that people have for changing things, and also for seeing the changes that people have demanded for a long time being able to be made in a few days, should motivate people to kind of take on this fight, because I can't see that there's anything kind of worth fighting harder for. And yeah, I don't see that it's something that we can't fight for.
Oh, thank you, Megan. So we're now that I have Michael respond to those questions, if that's okay with you, Michael. 7 minutes or so. Go ahead.
For sure, that's definitely okay. So I'll take the questions. I'm looking at 3 questions here, and I'll go in reverse. So to the first one, I really like a lot of what Megan said about the politicization of science. Unfortunately, here in the U.S., that has a very long history in this country. Yeah, for everything from eugenics to, I mean, they use slavery. They had a lot of junk science around that. I mean, there was a book in this country, I think about 20 or 30 years ago, called The Bell Curve, that was very popular, and it was talking about the fact that, you know, there was different IQ levels for different races, which is just ridiculous, and it's been debunked. I think what we have to, you know, I think as socialists and as working class people, I think what we have to bring to the forefront is, you know, science is not outside of class politics in these societies. The people who are going to be screaming for you to reopen the economy and go back to work, they're not making scientific arguments. They're making arguments based upon their profits. So I think we have to point that out to people, you know, be very, very frank with them, very upfront with them that these folks are not, you know, also in this country, another thing I left out, you know, we've had a big movement, you know, that's funded by, you know, the big polluters and big oil here about climate change denial. So, you know, that's another example of science being, you know, succumb to the profit motive in people's wallets instead of, you know, human beings being able to survive and thrive together and, you know, protecting the Earth's ecology. But like I said, science is not above class in society, so we have to tackle both at the same time. And we just have to keep insisting that, you know, human need and human cooperation and our well-being comes before anybody's profits. That's the real science. As far as the second question about these folks with guns at the legislature across the country, you know, there was actually an example, you know, several decades ago where the Black Panthers here in the state of California, you know, they went to the steps of the state capitol in Sacramento here in my state with their guns. And we saw the response to that, you know, Ronald Reagan, when he was the governor here before he became the president eventually, you know, he basically instituted the Mulford Act. I believe that's what it was called, which basically, you know, banned people from, you know, openly brandishing weapons, loaded or unloaded. So I think we already know what the response to that would be. I've been posting a lot about that on Facebook and getting some really spirited responses from people. And then the other question is, would there be less racism since black deaths are being widely discussed? Just a short answer, you know, I don't see a direct correlation myself. I think the only way to eradicate racism is how it's always been done, which is through, you know, real hard struggle, people forging alliances and realizing that, you know, they have mutual interests, and it's not in their interest to be divided up against each other. Because if you're working at the same factory, or you're driving in the same truck, or you're working in the same fast food restaurant, you're getting exploited all the same as your coworker, you know, regardless of race. Now, of course, we know that, you know, these disparities in outcomes, they hit different populations differently and worse. But, you know, at the end of the day, the name of the game is exploitation, and that's what capitalism does. So I think, you know, there's a great opportunity here for socialists to really go into workplaces and into community organizations, and even amongst those who are unorganized, and really, you know, make those appeals and make those those arguments for, real class solidarity across racial lines. Plus, the fact is, I mean, most people are not that reactionary. I mean, there's a lot of reactionary ideas and uneven class consciousness in this society. But, what I've found in my own organizing is a lot of that melts away when you just ask people questions. And, not only do you just ask them questions, but, this happens during the course of struggle as well. So there's a dialectic between those two that, that we need to really keep hammering at. And then what else do we say? What can we do to fight for anti-racist conclusions amongst this crisis or after this crisis? I think just confront it head on. As Yuri talked about earlier, there is no colorblind societies. That's not where we live at. We're not in a post-racial land. So we have to confront these things head on and not be afraid to talk about them very frankly, and build bonds and solidarity with those that we can build with. Yeah, we're not always going to be able to build with everybody, but there's plenty of people out there, particularly now in this crisis, that we can build with. So we just have to find those outlets and try to plug into them.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was incredible. So our next speaker is going to be Yuri, coming back on this question. So Yuri, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I'd like to answer the question about politics and science, which Megan and Michael have both gone into. See, I think, when you think about the way the government has repeated a kind of mantra that we are guided by the science, is what they keep saying, as if to say that there's no political decisions being made in this virus. Actually, what we're doing is just responding to the basic laws of science, which are impervious to these kind of class considerations. And that they hoped would build a kind of firewall between them and how people's experience of the crisis made them feel. But I think you only have to go back to what the ideas that Boris Johnson was experimenting with at the beginning of the crisis, the so-called herd immunity strategy, in which they were basically saying we're going to allow 250,000 people in Britain to die because to do anything else would disrupt the economy. And then you get a sense, well, that was guided by someone's science. The person who came up with the figures was a scientist. And that should tell us that science isn't neutral. Science exists within the context of a capitalist society, and that therefore our job as working class people, as socialists, is to interrogate the science. We need to ask questions. I don't put myself above someone who studies disease. I don't put myself above someone who studies public health, but I do expect to be able to ask them questions and to think about what the implications of them, their policies are, to be able to put to them the class and racial disparities that exist in Britain and how would their policy affect those questions. See, I think that experts have their place, but experts have to be subservient to the class needs of society as a whole, rather than people who act independently of everyone else, thinking that somehow or another they exist in an enlightened sphere that the rest of us can never hope to enter. So I think we have to get the science question the right way round. On the question about whether there'll be less racism in the future, I think it's a really interesting question, because who would have thought that papers like the Daily Mail and the Sun and so on would be in a position where even they have to acknowledge that this crisis is hitting BME people harder than it's hitting the general white population. These are the people who've been telling us all the time that we're constantly moaning about race and trying to bring race into everything, and they're forced to acknowledge it. So something has changed, but has something changed because they've opened their eyes and they've now become enlightened and so on? No, I think what's happened is that for a whole section of their readership have become aware that something we've been arguing for a long time is actually true. And for media to have any influence, it has to relate to where its readership is at. It means that in some extent, we have won some important arguments about the racist nature of the society we live in. However, what we must really know about racism is that all the battles that we win are at best temporary under capitalist society. things can move backwards, and they can move backwards very quickly. And I think it was Megan who was talked in the first section about the sort of the good immigrant and the bad immigrant, the way we are presented with good immigrants as people who contribute. Well, now, of course, good immigrants are people who work in the caring industry, people who work in the NHS, people who drive your Uber, people who serve you in a shop, and so on. They're the good immigrants. But be quite aware that they still have in mind who they think of as the bad immigrant. The bad immigrant is the person who doesn't necessarily speak English very well. The bad immigrant is the person who wasn't allowed to work during this crisis. You know, you may have read the report recently about Indian students in Britain who are stranded here because it's not possible to get back to India. You're not allowed to work, and so therefore you're destitute and on the streets collecting money. That's a bad immigrant. That's an immigrant who's not contributing. So we have to be really aware that the future of race politics in Britain will be as contested as it was before, but some of the parameters may well shift. So I think we should think in those terms. Michael is obviously best placed to talk about the racial divide in the States, and what he said I think was really important. I would just like to say that I think the history of the racial divide in the American working class is vital to anyone who wants to overcome racism anywhere, because America is the kind of citadel of racism in the capitalist society. It's the place where racial division is most sharply expressed and has the worst outcomes. So, you know, we have to study the US if we want to end racism everywhere. And I just think that sometimes the history of racism in America is presented in too simplistic a fashion, you know, as though that there's this divide, it's almost insurmountable, white workers are irredeemably racist, and that has consequences, and so on. I'd like people to think about reading this book, which is called Hammer and Home, which is about the struggles in the 1930s to forge an interracial trade union and socialist movement, which for a period was successful enough to make it a real challenge to racism in the United States, so much so that the state and the Ku Klux Klan and so on had to throw everything at it to break it. What we draw on is a tradition of militant anti-racism and militant trade unionism, and the links forged between the two, and the power that presents. And for us, that's the most inspiring tradition. The people who fought under those circumstances truly are the heroes of the working class movement. And I think what that tells us is that in a situation where we are fighting the state, we have got many enemies amongst racists and in the press and so on. It's extremely difficult to fight alone. It's a difficult task to fight as an individual in this society. And that's why I want to close by saying that if you've enjoyed this meeting, if you've enjoyed the politics of this meeting, I think you should seriously consider joining the Socialist Workers' Party, because you'll be amongst people who want to fight, who will fight absolutely to end the racial divide, to smash prejudice wherever we find it, and in order to try and win a better society. And if you agree with all of that, we'd love to have you with us. So that's me done.
Thank you so much, Yuri, and thank you to all our speakers for joining us today. I think that was absolutely amazing. When Yuri suggested a book, I thought he was going to plug himself, but he didn't, so I'm going to do it again. I'm going to plug you, Yuri, on A Rebel's Guide to Martin Luther King and Say It Loud, Marxism and the Fight Against Racism, which you can both buy on Bookmarks, which is independent bookshop, which of course at this moment in time is struggling. Please do buy as many books as possible online or leave a donation. And as well, just to lead off, we have a couple of more announcements. There is an important meeting this Wednesday on No Return to Unsafe Workplace, which has an amazing lineup of speakers, including John McDonald and so forth. So please do join that. It's this Wednesday at 6 o'clock, sorry. Yeah, so there you go, it's up on the screen, so join that. And there's also a day of action the following day. So I think I just want to reiterate what Yuri was saying about the struggle continues, and we have better future and a different future, and we can't just wait. Now we have to be a part of the action, Arxivum, better PPE and so forth, but also demanding for change in the world in which we live in. So please do join the Socialist Workers' Party. The link is below. Yeah, so I think that's how I kind of wanted to end our meeting. Thank you everyone for joining, and please do continue to share this meeting as widely as possible because it's incredibly important. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you to our speakers once again.